Good day, everyone. Welcome to our webinar presentation. My name is Adam Harris, Managing Director for C-Therm Technologies. Very pleased to welcome you to our presentation today. We've been hosting these webinars on a almost weekly basis the past year. Today's format's a bit different than previous webinars. I see a number of repeat attendees. So today will look a little bit different. Today we've brought together some of the different thought leaders in the textile industry to form a panel discussion, specifically looking at international test methods and best practices in developing internal standards for textiles. So out of that area, we've formulated some different questions, and we're going to probe some different areas of related interest in the development of standards and best practices in measuring performance of textiles. The session is going to run for approximately 1 hour. At the end of the session, we will reserve some time for a Q&A as well. Do make use of the chat box feature as we progress through the discussion. If we don't catch the comment or question in real time, we will make a point of revisiting it in the Q&A session. I did just want to provide a real quick introduction to who C-Therm Technologies is. See a lot of familiar faces online with us today, but there's also some folks that may not be familiar with us as an organization. We're based here in Atlantic Canada, but we're an international specialist when it comes to measuring and quantifying thermal performance as it relates to touch. So we've developed a line of sensor technology that can help characterize touch properties, specifically quantifying the feeling of warmth or coolness, a cool touch, warm feel, of different performance materials. This supports a wide range of applications in characterizing thermal performance of wearables, performance textiles, consumer goods, automotive interiors, and building materials. We also do a lot in thermal conductivity. But this is what we're best known for in the textile space, is that quantifying of touch properties as it relates to warm feel or cool touch. We do this by measuring directly the effusivity of a material. The higher that effusivity, the cooler the material is going to feel. You get a little bit of a sense of the scale here. It's not a linear scale presented, but we've focused it really in the area of textiles. Most textiles fall in the range of about 50 to 400 units. As a point of comparison, you could look at water, which is on the kind of extreme end of this. And also very relevant in a lot of textiles is the performance as materials are wetted. But water has an effusivity as a basis of comparison of about 1,600 units. So that's a big dramatic difference in the touch property of water versus textiles. And this can be used to quantify performance, to help in material selection, claims validation, quality control, and really having something that's very reproducible and quantifiable in terms of measuring that performance. This was formalized under ASTM D7984, which is a test method developed approximately 5 years ago. It was originally started with researchers at Mark's Work Warehouses, which is a major Canadian retailer. It focuses a lot on thermal underwear and related product categories. I don't know if we have Shannon Yanni on the line with us. Shannon, I think I might have seen you in the registration, but certainly want to give a shout out there for all the great work Shannon and her team have done over the years in developing and formalizing this standard. We've been hosting these webinars pretty much weekly. Since the start of COVID, we've really pivoted a lot of our activities. We can't travel, we can't do the conferences and get together as we normally would. So we've put an emphasis, like many organizations, in going more virtual and digital. And we've really focused on generating additional educational application-related content. And we're bringing in different thought leaders, different experts to supplement C-Therm's own domain expertise in these areas. The webinar seems to be quite popular as a program, and we see a lot of repeat attendees, and certainly appreciate that level of interest. And just wanted to put a marker for some upcoming discussions that are scheduled. Next week, we have improving insulation performance with microspheres. After that, early February, we're going to the next generation of building materials, looking at thermal conductivity and R-value testing. Late February, we have innovations in crack growth testing with DMA. That'll bring in an expert from Metrovib, a partner of ours. It's part of the AQM group, world leader in DMA testing based out of France. Very strong applications in composites and tires, rubber, etc. Of direct interest to the textile field, the end of February, we have a session on quantifying thermal touch performance, specifically measuring cool touch and warm feel. So if you're interested in a little bit more what we do in that area, I would suggest signing up for that webinar. Rosa Chen, who's deserving of a shout out of her own, has helped us organize this session with the panelists, and she's going to be active in the chat box as we progress through the presentation. But she has dropped in a link there where to register for those webinars if it's of interest. All right, I want to quickly get to the main stars of our show here. We've got a really great panel that we've put together. I'm going to be introducing them and just giving a little bit of a sense of their background. I probably don't even need to do this, to be honest, because I know many of you already know Diana, Haskell, and Nancy. But I do just want to speak to how lucky we are to have them online with us. And I'll give you a little bit of a sense of their background, but true thought leaders in the industry. Diana Wyman is Executive Vice President of AATCC. That's a professional association and standards development organization for the global textile industry. A self-proclaimed textile nerd, I love that. Diana has been involved in all aspects of textile testing, from managing a contract lab to developing specifications for a retail brand. She participates in the standards development process as both staff and volunteer for AATCC, as well as textile-related committees of ASTM, IEC, IPC, and ISO. Haskell Beckham, Senior Director of Innovation at Columbia Sportswear Company. Dr. Beckham joined Columbia after 5 years at Exponent, a leading scientific and engineering consulting firm, and 20 years at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he taught courses in chemistry, textiles, and materials, and led a research program focused on the development and evaluation of polymers and textiles. He earned a BSc in Textile Chemistry from Auburn University and a Ph.D. in Chemistry from MIT. Nancy Pepinito, consultant based in Portland, Oregon. The majority of her career has been with apparel, performance, and fashion brands in quality, testing, and standards management at companies such as Patagonia, Talbots, and Nike. Nancy provided technical expertise to a wide range of brands, from small startups to large global companies. Her consultancy focuses on materials and products with an emphasis on standards, compliance, and labeling. Very grateful to have each of you online with us. This, I think, promises to be a really great discussion. I'm going to close out the slide presentation so we can maximize the field of view on each of you. We'll start by throwing out a few questions. And for the audience's benefit, we've had some preliminary discussion. We got together, I think, before the Christmas break and talked about the topic, what were some of the trends, some of the ideas that would really be deserving of some discussion. And so we've put together a bit of a list here that we're going to run through and have some open discussion on. I think it should prove to be illuminating and insightful with the different views on the panel today. So I'm going to start with really just kind of a good question orienting us all on the difference between a test method and a test standard. There's often, I think, confusion between the two. I myself have fallen victim to that in the past, but maybe we could start there, just helping defining the difference between what is a test method and a test standard, and how do they differ? Anyone want to jump in there?
I'll start, I guess. Part of it
Give
anyway.
it a shot. Okay.
Are we kind of? This is a challenge with the panel, right? We're a little bit of a lag time. So I guess just to kind of back up in general, when you're trying to identify or figure out what you want to test, you want to know what is the property you're testing for. And then there's generally a test method by which how you're going to carry out a physical test on that material. And then there's a standard, which would be like, what is your pass-fail criteria for that? In addition to that, and people who work in brands know this, it's like, what are you really going to accept for that? Because sometimes there are things, test orders, small orders, something that may not quite meet your standard, but you feel like it might be doable, or have to make a conditional kind of approval for something. So there's sort of that range of things when you're communicating something to a supplier or to a lab, how you want things to be carried out.
Excellent. Diana, do you want to weigh in there as well?
Yeah, so I think, the terminology is really important because there is so much overlap and confusion. And I might define a standard a little bit differently than the way Nancy did. In my mind, a standard is anything that's standardized, and it could come in a lot of different shapes. So a standard test method would be a standard terminology document might be a standard. But then we have what we call specifications. And that's really what I think a lot of people refer to as standards, and Nancy was going with it, where we actually say, here's the requirement. And so a lot of people use standard there, but you'll also see it used more generically to just mean a consensus document or something that's standardized. A test method, I think, is pretty straightforward. When we say a test method, that's exactly what it is. It's a method for performing a test. So I think the standard and specification is where a lot of the confusion lies. And it's probably not cruel that you use one word or another, but it is really important that you communicate clearly when you're talking to others, that they understand what you mean and what you're looking for when you ask for a standard.
Yeah, I love this question. I think it's an important discussion to have. What I often believe I run into is that the use of the word standard, I think, has different meanings for different people. And so, for example, when I joined the industry, I would often run into people who would say, well, we have to meet we have to meet this industry standard. And my next question was, well, why do we have to do that? And I think that's part of a larger discussion about what's a voluntary versus mandatory requirement for the goods and services that any company or entity within a single industry. And ours, for us, it's textiles and garments and apparel and footwear. And so I think it actually gets confused out there to some extent because they're called standards. And the truth is, the only thing that any of us have to submit our garments to really are what's really mandatory, and what's mandatory is what's required by governments, and therefore it becomes a regulation, right? Everything else is voluntary. Now, voluntary standards are absolutely critical, and for buyers and sellers to have discussions, for brands and manufacturers in order to sell their product, to make specific claims to protect themselves against some potential future issue with the product, but they are voluntary. And so, the other thing too, and I think this is a topic we're going to get into that I've often found interesting from my perspective, is that there are multiple test methods, multiple standards for any given performance attribute. And so the question is, well, which one do you use and why do you use it? And of course, a lot of times that comes down to, well, what are you trying to communicate? And it can be completely confusing depending on what you're measuring, because there are multiple ways to measure certain things. And I'll use an example that I like to use a lot: waterproofness or breathability. It becomes a challenge, actually, in order to simply communicate between buyers and sellers, or it can be a challenge. So, because if you report one number from one particular test method or standard, that's actually a voluntary standard. It doesn't necessarily mean that the product is performing worse than another product that was tested with a different test to ostensibly get to the same performance attribute, but gives you a lower number. You just always have to look at the details of what you're being tested in general. So, but I think, and I'd like to ask Diana to comment on this because she and I have talked about this in the past. AATCC specifically refers to their group of standards as test methods, not standards, whereas ASTM has a slightly different, I think, definition there. So Diana, if you don't mind, if you could clarify that for me and for our audience.
So I think for both AATCC and ASTM, we use standards as kind of that overarching umbrella, but most of the standards that AATCC develops are in fact test methods. We have a few other things. We have things we call evaluation procedures. It's a little bit different. We have some lab procedures, things like that, but put them all under the standards umbrella. And I think ASTM takes very much the same approach. They do it much more, I guess, methodically and officially. So everything in that book of standards is a standard, but there are different categories. They have test method standards, they have terminology standards, they have specification standards, they have, help me out, there's about 5 or 6 more categories, all considered standards because they are standardized. They're not something that one person came up with and said, hey, I think we should do it this way. It's something that a group have come together and agreed upon to standardize. I don't know a better word. Yep. So I think that approach is really similar, but it is really just semantics. A lot of people use the word standards to mean a lot of different things. I think you guys both hit on a really important aspect of the mandatory versus, it being optional, or, something that you decide to do. And particularly in the US and almost to the same extent in Canada, most of what we do in the textile industry is voluntary. There's not a whole lot of regulatory stuff other than like health. That is not true. Since this is an international standards presentation, it should be addressed. In other countries, that is not the case. In a lot of places where if you want to sell this as a t-shirt or claim it as moisture wicking, there may be some very specific specifications that you need to meet. Whereas in the US, it's just kind of voluntary. And if people like it, they keep buying. And if they don't, they don't.
That's right. Yeah,
Did we go completely off?
Yeah, the industry in this country has
it's good. Carry on.
Has really kind of adopted a self-policing point of view in terms of many of the performance attributes that we like to make claims about with our products.
Well, that's a good segue to the next question, which is really on who defines the performance thresholds. How should those best be set? Is it by the standards bodies themselves versus an internally, brand developed performance threshold or standard? Any thoughts on that? Who's best positioned to define those performance thresholds?
I'll start with that, I guess. So going back to the question, what's mandatory, what's voluntary? Of course, if it's mandatory, you really have no option but to follow it and meet the standard and the requirement. And there is no, making kind of a call that if it doesn't meet the standard to let it go, it would stop your production and make you change the way you're doing it. But for those things that are voluntary, it's just consumer perception or history of what you've built up on what you know is good for your product. If, like Diane was saying, if consumers keep buying it and your moisture wicking product that you claim to be acceptable and the standard that you have seems to work for your consumer, then you should continue to use that if that meets your requirement. Oops, sorry, I've got a phone ringing in the background. But there really is no requirement unless you can set your own standard. If you make a claim on a product, for example, like moisture management, as long as you have your internal standard and you're making a claim against it, as long as it's meeting your internal standard and the standard that you've set for that, then it's okay, because there is really no legal requirement to meet that. I mean, it becomes a truth in advertising claim on your tag.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'll add to that too. I'll bring up the example I brought up a second ago, one of my favorite properties to talk about, which is waterproofness. Lots of different ways to test for it. But if if you're selling a product you claim is waterproof and it gets out in the marketplace and consumers are getting soaking wet every time they wear it, that's obviously not going to work for you. And so it makes it easy, I think, in that case, to figure out how to set your specification. And to add on to what Diana said too, other countries have taken different approaches. China, for example, they set minimum specifications themselves for some of these performance attributes that we just haven't set here in the U.S. And I guess in the U.S. we're taking more of a let the consumers sort this out themselves, which can actually lead to confusion. The early part of my career, I used to go around giving presentations railing against the industry about not giving consumers more information about that. And, and in hindsight too, I was probably even advocating for to basically have more testing to be mandatory. Now that I'm on the other side and I work for a brand, I have a better understanding of the differences in the U.S. in this market versus other markets in terms of what's mandatory versus voluntary. But, so for example, just to finish this thought, in China, there's a minimum specification for what you can claim as waterproofness and a definition for a test method.
Diana, does AATCC have a position in terms of best practice?
I think there's definitely.
Say that again, Adam.
I'm sorry, I think there's a bit of a
so AATCC does have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, AATCC does have a clear policy on that. So AATCC, we talked about between test methods and specifications, and AATCC does not set the specifications. We'll give you a procedure for how to see just how water resistant your fabric is, but we'll never tell you whether that 5 is good or bad. And the theory has been that that's really up to the buyer and seller, because there isn't one answer. Depending on your end use, depending on your price point, depending on the particular product that you're making, there may not be one answer for those kinds of things, particularly when it's kind of a performance feature. Do I need it to be really, really water resistant, or do I just need it to be a little water resistant? Do I need it to be water resistant forever or for a single use? And so the theory has been that, it's really up to the buyer and seller. There are definitely pros and cons to that approach. It gives a lot more flexibility to the buyer and seller. It also means that they have to be much more educated about making those choices, about what method to use, about what pass-fail criteria to use. And then the consumer obviously also has to be educated and understand what all those numbers mean, or what it means when everybody says they're water resistant. We can simplify things by making a government regulation that says if you call it water resistant, you do this test and you get this answer, and that's it. Much easier. But, I think there's some pretty obvious drawbacks to that approach too. Whatever reason, politically or socially or whatever, the U.S. has mostly refrained from regulating performance and quality. They do get involved when there's health and safety aspects to it, but for the most part, if you get wet in the rain, you're unlikely to suffer serious health effects.
Excellent. I'm just going to change gears a little bit here, just talking more about the dynamics of the tests in question or potentially to be standardized. Maybe just ask you to speak on the difference between a lab test versus a real world test. I know in some earlier discussions, we talked a little bit about the example of a standard wash versus, maybe something more representative of something a consumer would do in their home in terms of washing the clothes. And ultimately, what's more appropriate for us in administering as a test, a test in that respect? Anybody want to touch that one?
I'd love to touch that one. And then again, I'm sure I'll pass it to Nancy and Diana. But yeah, I mean, I think the most important purpose for all of these standard tests is, as I think I said at the top of the hour here, it really greases the wheels of commerce, allows buyers and sellers to communicate with each other using a common language, right? If I'm trying to sell something to someone, I need to be able to communicate its quality, its performance, its safety in a way that is kind of universally accepted as scientifically reliable and valid. And that's what standard tests are for. So in those cases, it kind of doesn't really matter if the test methods represent real world scenarios. On the other hand, if you're really trying to communicate to consumers a certain performance level, then I think the conversation is different. And I think it really is important. And we do both at Columbia, and even before I got to Columbia, I was a big advocate for doing both. You do the standard testing if the standards exist, but you also take it a step further and say, okay, well, is that relevant for what a consumer how the consumer may interact with that product? And if it is, great, you're done. But if it's not, then I think it's important to really look into developing what I would call customized test. And we do a lot of that, which is great. A lot of times, a lot of information, because it hasn't been standardized, as Diana was using that term earlier in the hour, and because it hasn't been standardized, sometimes it's difficult actually to then communicate that further than what we use. A lot of times, especially if you're developing novel products, innovative products, new products, you really have to develop new test methods to distinguish the product from what exists in the marketplace. And in many cases, that is really the genesis of what ultimately you can become a standardized or standard test.
I have a little bit of a different opinion. I think we talked about this on the pre-call we had. So in my view, you're really trying to make sure that the consumer is satisfied with whatever they're buying from you. That's the key thing. I mean, is it working for them? Is it lasting for them? Is it performing the way that they expect it to? Durability is, important. So a lot of these tests, you don't have the time to put something out and have somebody wear it for a year and decide if it's acceptable or not. Does it shrink too much? Does it pill after a year of use, or, after it's been laundered, 8 or 10 times? You kind of want to vet that out. So testing has been a way to accelerate the replication of consumer use. So, some of the ways they've been done has been satisfactory, and sometimes not so much. There are many ways to do tests or test a property. Like you mentioned, waterproofness, there's many ways, because for some reason, the first way someone did it wasn't meeting their needs. And so they invented yet another way to do it, and another way to do it, and another. And that exists for pilling and snagging and stretch and all kinds of things. So there are a lot of ways you could test something. But in my opinion, you're trying to really vet out what a consumer would be satisfied with.
Yeah, Nancy, I don't disagree with any of that at all. I will tell you the discussions we often have here internally is, And I'm a skeptic by nature in general. It's probably because of my training in science, but we often have discussions about, well, okay, here's the standard test. You brought up pilling. We do a lot of abrasion testing, for example. And this is actually goes back to some of Diana's comments too, where they develop these test methods, but they don't tell you what the minimum acceptable performance level is, right? And so to your point that, yeah, you don't have time to put things out on the market for 5 to 10 years or longer, because some of the products that we put out there are expected to really last a very long time. How can we do accelerated testing to try to get to what's relevant for the consumer? And then trying to connect those dots, I think, is really challenging. There are all kinds of accelerated aging things that you can do to assess some attributes, but some of the things like pilling and abrasion, we make our best estimates, and it's based on experience in the marketplace. I think you just referred to this as well, in order to come up with what our minimum specification is. So I agree with you.
There's an interesting comment there from the audience, just coming on U.S. Customs Border Patrol, and don't they have criteria for labeling waterproofness? So a response there from you, Diana. Anything you wanted to expand on?
Well, Customs has
that was just a really good call out. I was just, I had said we don't have a water resistance specification in the U.S. And we don't, but for imports to call something a waterproof jacket, Karen's exactly right. There is a test and a specification using test method AATCC test method 35. So yes, there are other exceptions, including those in water resistance.
But that is only to qualify it for duty duty purposes, not for what a tag might say. So regardless of how it tests for duty purposes, that may not be satisfactory for the consumer or make any kind of requirement to make that claim on your product.
Yeah, it's an important distinction, I think.
Kind of expanding on the earlier question there with Haskell and some of our earlier discussion, we talked a little bit about the concept of an arms race, and I'm going to steal this from Haskell's quote. But when certain tests become standardized, then product development sometimes becomes overly optimized around those tests, rather than focus on potential consumer benefits. This is where the potential arms race kind of comes in, and really the question: do standardized methods stifle innovation in this sense? Anybody want
to? Well, I think I'll respond quickly since you invoked my quote there. Yeah. So what Adam's referring to is that I made some comment in our previous discussions that, in my opinion, sometimes standard testing has resulted in an arms race in terms of material and product development to see who can introduce a material to the marketplace that performs the best on a given standard. If you really start to look in more detail about that standard, and actually I know in the audience is Craig Simile. I've had discussions with him in the past about this as well. So he may know what I'm referring to here as an example. But I've seen, in my opinion, I think that's happened to some extent in the industry. Does it stifle innovation? I don't really think so, because I think people recognize it for what it is. It's important. Sometimes people are making decisions based on a performance on a given standard. So it's important for certain parties to do the best they can, and it gives targets for people to go to. So I wouldn't say it's stifled innovation necessarily. But I think it's always important to look at the details of the test, understand what the test is really going after. Because in my opinion and in my experience, I have discussions with people in the industry a lot of times, and I start asking questions about, well, what is that actually testing? And then the conversation doesn't go very far. So I think it's important always to go look at the details of the test and to understand exactly what you're testing.
I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I would agree with Haskell. I don't.
Let's go Diana first, and then we'll go to Nancy.
So I was just agreeing with Haskell. I don't think that it necessarily stifles innovation, but it does sometimes complicate the question. I think it's a little bit like, we talk about it in our education system too, teaching to the test. So I don't necessarily think that people aren't being more creative, but they are very often, maybe focusing their efforts where they know there is a number, a specific target, something that they can reach. And at some point, is it even meaningful? After 100,000 rubs in an abrasion test, does it matter if it's 200,000 or 300,000? Does it matter if it's 300,000 millimeters of pressure of water? Are those numbers even meaningful? They're higher than your competitors, but does it, is it useful to the consumer? So that's where I see a little bit of an issue. I don't think it stifles innovation. I think people are still doing fabulous things. But maybe there are other places where that creativity could be directed.
I think where this is most prevalent is in the outdoor, the breathability and the waterproofness numbers, because there are a lot of hang tags on those products. And I think the consumers in that market, the people who are real, outdoor geeks, look for those numbers and the little, temperature gauges and the charts and the whatever on the tags, the fancy tags. They become quite complicated hang tags. But, you'll see a lot of the vendor or the, fabric manufacturers of those types of materials doing these tests too. And they will, this is my opinion, the way they will test all the different ways to test breathability or all the different ways to test waterproofness and show you the one that has the highest numbers and values. And it could be one method with one fabric and another method with another. And the brand is still going to test it to what they've deemed as their pass-fail criteria. So, regardless of what the vendor is selling you or showing you, you're still going to vet it yourself as a brand. But yeah, that's kind of that arms race thing you're talking about. They're just trying to give you a high number because they think that that's what you want to see and not really what might be the best for the consumer.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I've actually had third-party labs give me numbers on a test that once I started digging into the details of the test with them, realized that they had run it in such a way to get the biggest numbers because they said those are the numbers that most of their clients typically want to see. And I'm going, well, but the way you ran that test doesn't make any sense to me. So let's go back and rerun it. I want to know what the answer is, for on the materials I sent you. So yeah, so full circle.
Diana, in some of the earlier discussions, there was, I think, a point you raised that was really interesting, just on the value of the historical test data. And I might ask you just to expand a little bit on that in terms of, the underlying value of kind of codifying some of these test methods and, the historical legacy that they can kind of create as you do product development.
Yes, I think you had mentioned in the previous question washing machines as an example, and that's certainly one that I've been intimately involved in. The question comes down to there's new washing machine technology, and there's new washing machine technology every year, if not every couple of months. And so what makes sense for testing? Do we need to be testing garments in the latest, greatest washing machine because that's what's out there? Or do we need to be washing in a very consistent manner, even though it may be a 50-year-old washing machine? And I think there's a very fine balance there. when it comes to lab testing, my personal opinion is that consistency kind of gets precedence. That's the idea behind lab testing, is to control the variables. We recognize that it's not going to be exactly the way it is in real life. And that's true of anything, but an abrasion test. And even if you've never seen an abrasion test, you imagine in some laboratory machine, you're going to rub something against something else. And you know that whatever you're rubbing, however you're rubbing, it's not the way it works in real life, but it's representative, it's consistent, it's something that we can reproduce, we can do in multiple labs, multiple years, and get a meaningful result to compare products. And I think laundering is exactly the same. I would rather see it washed in the same machine, on the same cycle, at the same temperature, over and over again in labs across the world and over time, so that I can compare results. If I'm always chasing the latest technology, I really have no way to say that this fabric that I washed today is better or worse or equal to a fabric that I washed 10 years ago. So there certainly is a balance, and there absolutely is a place for real life, modern technology, the latest and greatest, take it out into the real world. But I think when we're trying to develop lab tests, we recognize that they are lab tests, and the priority is to control the variables. And sometimes that means sticking with something that isn't as high tech as we might like. If you see some of the lab test equipment that's used, AATCC tests are fabulous. We've got a funnel with a nozzle and we pour water through it. But we've been doing it for, 80 years, and it works and it's consistent. And so there is some value there. Do we need new tests to recognize new technologies? Absolutely. But consistency is important for lab testing. But that's all I got.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to expand out the horizon a little bit, recognizing this is international standards we're talking about, of course. One of the things we're hearing a lot more in the discussion with the client stakeholder discussions we're participating in is the increasing prominence of the GB standards. Of course, those are the nationally developed Chinese standards. Curious, and we'll kind of maybe see who wants to jump in here, but what kind of trends you're seeing as it relates to the increasing prominence of GB standards? Anybody want to respond?
Yeah, so I can say that I don't know about increasing prominence. They're absolutely just prominent as far as I'm concerned. They can be challenging sometimes because, we talked earlier about how certain things aren't mandatory in North America, and whereas they are in other regions, and China is certainly one of those. The GB standards are something that we have to be cognizant of and test to. Sometimes we have to change labeling. Sometimes we can't sell certain product in the China market because of these GB standards, because again, they've codified a lot of attributes that we simply don't have standard, that is not mandatory to test for in North America. So it's something that we live with for sure.
I'll talk a little bit about it. So we had talked, I guess knowing where your markets are is important. So if you're selling in the US, you really have no need for that. But as companies become more and more global and want to sell in the market, because China is a big market and a big opportunity for many brands, they want to sell there. So this is dictating a lot of what they have to conform to. And it's, it is making a challenge, making it challenging for them. Brands still will do their own battery of tests and maybe do in addition, supplement those GB tests. And in some cases, they may be just adopting the GB test as the test because they have to meet it. For some of these are maybe more basic tests and not highly performance tests, but for safety and things like that, you have no way to get around those. But there may be ways that you're testing a certain safety property to one government's requirement and a safety requirement to another government's requirement, and maybe have to then do them both ways, and in order to sell and label in both markets.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, it's certainly a complication for those that are selling in multiple, whether it's China and the US or multiple areas. But I think there's some good news with it. As they become more prevalent, it's easier to get a hold of a translation. A few years ago, you had to translate them yourselves or speak Chinese, which I do not. So now it's a little easier to get a hold of those documents and understand what the requirements are. I think, another aspect of it is very often the methods are either directly or very nearly copied from methods that may already be in use, whether it's ISO methods or AATCC, ASTM methods. So usually there's not a huge difference. You're not actually having to do two completely different tests. But that's not always the case. And that's not always the case even if you're testing for the US and Canada, there's different flammability tests you need to do. So it's not just China that has different rules. Wherever you're going, you have to be very cognizant of what the different regulations are, where there's overlap, where you can say, okay, I did this test and it's actually the same as this other test, or it's, supersedes this test or whatever. But yeah, it's definitely, as more people enter the China market, they've got to be aware of what's going on with those.
Just to expand on that a little further, question on what opportunities do we see to improve harmonization there? I'm particularly interested around where in some of those GB standards there are performance thresholds kind of baked into the standard itself. Does that create an encouragement for whether it's AATCC or ASTM or other standards bodies to try to harmonize around some aspects or otherwise of the standards? And that's not it's not specific just to China, of course, but kind of more broadly speaking, what opportunities are there for improved harmonization amongst these standards?
I think harmonization is really important.
Why don't we go to Nancy?
No. I was just going to say this is a question for Diana, because it's kind of in the standards bodies kind of realm.
Yeah, I would say I agree. I think this is a question for Diana. But before you start, Diana, on the harmonization question, I think it may be important to point out in terms of these China GB standards, how is it possible in the same way it is with ASTM and AATCC to be involved in developing those test standards? And at least for me personally, it's not as transparent in terms of how you do that. It's my understanding that you can, as a relevant person in the industry or a member of the industry, you can get involved in that. But if, for example, you've got a product doesn't necessarily meet a GB standard that's already established, there is something called an enterprise standard or a Q standard that you can work with the right authorities over there in order to develop so that you're allowed to make certain claims. And so that's certainly a possibility and certainly something that we've done in the past. So now, Diana, I'll pass it to you, but in terms of harmonization, because I think this harmonization question is a big issue. It would be so much easier if there was a single standardization society, entire planet, so that those of us who are involved in testing and validation and compliance, wouldn't have to look to so many different agencies. And a lot of times the test method may start in a single agency, but it gets adopted by another agency. And then the committee there may change a little thing that somebody doesn't notice. And anyway, please help us harmonize.
Yeah, that's probably a whole separate web. But to the GB standards particularly, it is much more challenging to be involved in that process. AATCC, ASTM are very open. Anybody who is interested in the topic can join the committee, make their voice heard, and vote on what we do with the test method. So those are very, very open. There are certainly other organizations. There's other national bodies. There's ISO. Where you do have to work through a national body, but you can still get involved. They're just a little bit challenging because they're run through a variety of different government agencies within China. But some of them do offer an ISO alternative where they're basically parallel test methods. In some cases, you can use the ISO method in place of the GB method. So maybe gives a little bit more opportunity. So I won't go down the complete harmonization route just because we are kind of running close on time. But, speaking as somebody who represents AATCC, one of those standards bodies, I will say that I am very encouraged to see more real concerted efforts towards harmonization. I think 10, 20 years ago, everybody just did their own thing and kind of, was focused on their projects, and whatever else was going on was going on. And now I think there really are some efforts to try and harmonize. It's difficult. Everybody still has their own stake. You have different people, different agendas. I think if you asked somebody in Europe, they would tell you that ISO is that one standards body to rule them all. But if you ask somebody at AATCC or at ASTM, we would say that, no, these are also global standards and have their own advantages. One of them, to me at least, one of the main advantages of those being that they are wide open. ISO has representation from a variety of countries, but each country gets one vote. And so if you've got 20 different experts with a lot of different great ideas, very often that gets stifled or lost in the mix. It's a majority rules kind of situation. So if you've got 10 countries and 6 of them vote yay, it moves on, and the rest of those comments aren't heard. Whereas AATCC will look at every vote. So even, out of 60 people, if one person votes no, we stop the process, look at those comments, make adjustments if needed, and then proceed. So there are pros and cons to both approaches, but it does make it really complicated to get everyone on the same page. Like I said, I am cautiously optimistic that we are moving in a good direction as far as that sort of thing.
Well, and Diana, I think you mentioned a really positive example, and was it Fiber Fragments, the global group there's some really positive harmonization efforts happening there. Did you want to say a few words on that?
Yeah, so fiber fragments, people talk a lot about microfibers. We're trying to move away from that terminology. But this idea that these little pieces of fiber are entering the waterways, being consumed by, wildlife and things like that, is a real issue. And it's a global issue. And I have been really, really encouraged by the amount of cooperation in trying to figure out, what are we going to do about this? This problem popped up, really kind of hit the mainstream a few years ago, and the textile industry immediately said, all right, let's find a solution, and agreed across the board for the most part that the first step was to be able to measure it. How much stuff comes off of various textiles. And so, we've been working with all kinds of organizations, both in the textiles as well as in environmental sciences and water sciences and all of those kinds of things, to come up with a test method. And we really have come up with something pretty well aligned. There's still, some things to be worked out, but we've, for the most part, agreed that this test method is going to use what we call the accelerated laundering machine. A lot of you are certainly familiar with that, the metal canisters that spin around to represent laundering. We've agreed on the type of filter that we're going to use, the mass of or construction of the specimen, how we're going to finish it, all those kinds of things. And it really has been a global effort across countries, across organizations to come up with something as quickly as possible, which I know doesn't seem like it, but in the standards world, a couple of years is pretty quick to go from concept to published standard. So it's getting there.
Very encouraging. Maybe a great example for other areas. Okay, we're coming up close to time, and I wanted to just reserve a little bit of opportunity for any questions that folks might want to submit through the chat box. If our audience has any questions you'd like particularly address folks, please enter them through the chat box. I have one question here from Robert. Nice to have you online with us, Robert. How can one define a gold standard textile or certified reference textile for validating a test method, i.e. for measuring a property of a textile, say thermal effusivity or otherwise? Is it even possible with so many independent manufacturing companies, brands, wear and tear, fashion trends, different regulations, etc.? Anyone who want to just comment maybe in general on the best practices?
So I'll speak briefly to this.
Perfect.
So it's one of the things that AATCC does in some cases is supply what we call a control fabric, not necessarily the gold standard in that it's the best fabric for whatever property you're measuring, but it's something with a very consistent value that you can basically use, as a reference standard, as a calibration, whatever terms you might want to use. And so we do have these for certain test methods. In the process of developing them for others, it's not easy because ideally you want something that, has a very consistent value when the test is done correctly, but also will let you know when the test is done incorrectly. So if it's something that has the same value no matter what you do, it doesn't really have much value. So you'd like to see it, always be a 5 when the test is done correctly. But if the temperature is too hot, it very quickly goes to a 6 and you know that something is wrong. So that's the most challenging part is finding something that's sensitive enough to what that key criterion is.
Excellent. Anybody else want to comment?
I think it has to be done on a attribute by attribute basis, not like one material would meet all your requirements. like there's a blue wool, like that's one thing. And then there might be one for a multi-fiber and one thing for, it wouldn't be all encompassing fabric that would meet all standards, but it might be one fabric that's good for one particular test.
Right.
I'm going to throw in one more question here. It's my own, and just I didn't preface it in the earlier discussions, but it's a question I often like to ask people. Is just if you had the magic wand and you could change one thing when you're thinking about the space of best practices in terms of developing international standards, test methods, performance, in what you see in the industry today. If you could change one thing, what would it be? And I'm just going to maybe start with Haskell and go around and just ask you to think about.
Yeah, so my answer is very easy. I mean, harmonization, I think, would make everyone's lives so much easier. And so if we would all just decide on the planet that we're all going to look toward a single organization, then that would actually make things easier, in my opinion.
I would agree that harmonization is important. It's challenging because you're asking suppliers to do a range of tests for the same property, and sometimes a brand's customized tests. And then you're asking labs to do the same thing. You're asking them to do, a test, and then brands customized tests. So they're doing, for wicking, for example, I mean, there have been now standardized tests for wicking, but for many, many years, there were quite a few brands doing quite a few methods, and labs making up their own methods for clients that didn't really have an internal way to specify it. So you're asking suppliers to do things, you're asking labs to do things a lot of different ways. And to make it easier on everyone, picking ways to do it, or at least standardized methods for ones that there aren't any, would be a good start.
Yeah, now I would, and wicking was a great example, by the way, too. But I would always advocate for the use of both standard as well as customized testing. I always have. I think it's important, and I think that's going to be it's going to be custom for a particular product, for a particular brand, for a particular market. And I think those are always. I think that's important. For me to clarify with my answer, for me, harmonization, I mean with the standard testing. So yeah.
But that's a question, like why, is there a property that's not being met? Why is something that you're doing so different than something that exists? And are other people doing the same thing? And you just don't know. And so you're asking labs and and vendors and to do all these different things. Wicking is an example. It's that everybody thought they had the one best wicking test, and but really everybody's doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So what is it about the test you're doing that makes it so special and unique to you, or to what you're testing? And eventually it will become commonplace. I mean, maybe right now you're the only person with that thing, but 2 years from now, it will be a known thing on the market, and everybody will be copying it and wanting to test things very similarly. So anyway, it's just a thought.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, as we develop novel products and we develop customized tests to distinguish the novel attributes for these novel products from everything else on the market, if eventually that becomes more commonplace, then these customized tests, as I was talking about earlier, really can be the genesis of what ultimately will be a new standard test.
Let's reserve the final word for Diana. So Diana, if you have that magic wand, you could change one thing.
I have to agree, honestly. Yeah. I have to agree on harmonization. I mean, even though I represent AATCC, which is one of the parties in the mix, I think if we could harmonize, it would benefit everyone. We wouldn't necessarily need to have one organization that does everything, but if everybody played to their strengths, we would have better tests for everything instead of lots of tests for everything, and we could spend more time on some of those additional needs that aren't being met right now. On a practical level, it really comes down to trust, both between organizations and all of those. I would love to see more harmonization testing, but once is enough. I don't need to do it 3 times.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll bring the panel to a close there. It sounds like a call for more harmonization. Pretty consistent message, but look, this has been a delightful conversation. I want to thank each of you, Haskell, Nancy, Diana, all in your own ways, providing really interesting insight and perspective on the industry as thought leaders in this space. And we know your time is very valuable, so we just want to say a really heartfelt thank you for joining us and being with us today and sharing your expertise and insight. I want to also thank the audience for taking time to join us. We hope this was an interesting session for you. Encourage you to have a look at some of the other upcoming webinars we have scheduled. We'd certainly be happy to have you back online with us. And if there's anything we can be of help with, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're going to segue, do our outro here with a short little video. But this will conclude our presentation in terms of the panel discussion. So thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, Adam, for organizing. Thanks, everyone.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Touch. It's one of our critical senses in perceiving the world. Everything from the clothes we wear to the bedding we sleep in. The thermoreceptors in our skin monitor and relay information to our brains about everything we come in contact with. This helps us make decisions about what feels pleasant to the touch and keeps us safe. Human skin is very good at detecting differences in a material's ability to transfer heat, such as the warmth of a fleece sweater compared to the coolness of leather. This material property is known as thermal effusivity. As a metric, it can be used to quantify a textile's ability to exchange thermal energy between skin and fabric. Here's why that's important. Because human test panels have established a positive correlation between our touch perception of the warmth or coolness of a textile to its thermal effusivity. In other words, our perception that certain materials will keep us warm or help us cool down is quantifiable. We know this is important in quantifying performance in a wide range of applications, including activewear, personal protective clothing, upholstery, diapers, neoprene dive suits, and bedding. Our skin's thermoreceptors are giving us good information, though subjective. The C-Therm TCI thermal analyzer quantifies warm and cool feel for you, making what was previously subjective into a metric that can be quantitatively measured. It provides accurate measurements across a range of real-world scenarios, including higher humidity environments and under varying compressive loads. Using the patented Modified Transient Plane Source Technique, MTPS, operating in accordance to ASTM D7984, the C-Therm TCI thermal analyzer directly measures both thermal effusivity and thermal conductivity. This technique determines the thermophysical properties of your sample within seconds, leaving the sample intact and undamaged. The C-Therm TCI measures the science of touch, so you can provide the comfort.